development?
You know, it's extraordinarily difficult to turn to someone of talent, someone who understands how the world works, and ask them, listen, go back to Guyana. It's incredibly difficult to do that. I couldn't, in all fairness, ask anyone to do it.
Population?
The population.
I mean, immigration? Would that be a solution?
I'm not sure if it's a solution, but what needs to happen is that we have to keep the human resource which we produce. We're sending people through schools, we're training them, and they're all leaving. No, that's a waste of money to start with. You know, and unfortunately, it's not just Guyana which suffers, it's the Caribbean as a whole is suffering this huge exodus of skills. So, and in fact, we are providing aid via human resources to places like the US. They don't have to train, you know, in the UK, for example, you know, if you want nurses, just give visas to Guyanese and Africans, and you got your nurses. You don't have to train them.
What do you think about those who have received scholarships from the government? And do you think there is an obligation to actually give back?
Absolutely. You know, I think if you enter into a contract, you have both a moral and a legal obligation to do it. And that's probably part of the reason, Selwyn, that I have such ambivalent views about even my citizenship, etc. I got a Guyana scholarship. It was a very generous Guyana scholarship. Okay, I think I served probably 6 of the, how many months? I think I was meant to serve 5 years, 60 months. So I probably have given back 1/10 of my legal and moral obligation to Guyana, which probably helps to explain the reason why through things like RLT and the various things I do, I try to give back. But I think we all have that obligation if we've been given.
You are, well, let me ask you this before. How did fatherhood affect your perspective on Guyana's politics?
Initially, it made it a lot more distant because you have the immediate obligations. You know, my daughter had, and still has very little sense of Guyanese. She's pretty much lived all her life in South Africa. Her mom is Zimbabwean. She was born in the US. You know, Guyana is this thing that exists that her father talks about wistfully. But as my daughter's grown and I've seen her become a human being and also develop allegiances, it's made me think a lot more about what my allegiances are. You know, I was sad and disappointed when I brought my daughter to Guyana. She had no sense of attachment. You know, she was just astounded. She said, why is it that the streets are so dirty? You know, that was her sense of Guyana. You know, why don't people, you know, why isn't City Hall, you know, which is this listed building, why is it kept in better condition? You know, why do people have to play music loud all night? No, that was her association with Guyana. And so it made me think, well, Kojo, you know, what is your own relationship with Guyana? And you've lived out now Guyana most of your life. And that's a continuing process of redefining my own relationship with Guyana.
I want to, well, I should ask you, what do you think personally about the May 11th elections?
I think they're interesting, but not particularly important in the long term. I think it will be, whoever wins will win by a narrow margin. As I said before, I think, well, I'm pretty sure that whatever happens, at least 45 to 49% of Guyana will be unhappy with the result. So I'm not sure it's going to change fundamentally the dynamic now where there's this antagonism and sense of apathy in society, to be quite honest. What I think it will do, to some extent, is to allow the, you know, it's a bit like a sore, an abscess. It will allow the beginning of a process of expunging some of the ill feeling. I mean, look at the language and the sort of images being generated by it. It's awful. I mean, there's nothing uplifting about any of the campaigns. You know, there's no vision, there's no sense, as we talked about earlier, about the Project Guyana. So I think this is a process, and I've been a little bit tongue in cheek of a lot of bitter old men sorting themselves out, feeling, we've waited long, or this is our time. And I think we should allow that process to play itself out, I've always said that it's not these elections that really matter in Guyana. It's either probably the ones after these, and certainly the ones after that. When I think we're going to have a relatively new slate, and hopefully by then, we would have started to fashion a sense of a Project Guyana.
Your thoughts on the escalating violence against women in Guyana, young girls and women?
I have 5 sisters and a mother. I grew up with my 5 sisters beating the hell out of me. It's never occurred to me that men had a right to abuse women in any form or the other. And I think as a society we should be ashamed of it. From either prominent persons in society or people entrusted with management of the state to show the sort of public disrespect for women is unacceptable. It really is not tenable.
Let's go to visit Africa, the motherland for a bit. Blacks are killing blacks in Juba and Johannesburg. What do you attribute to these fatal xenophobic attacks?
Well, the ones in South Africa are well known. South Africans, particularly black South Africans, have always been told that they're better than the rest of Africans. This is the way in which apartheid was justified. Black South Africans are told, yeah, you might be second-class citizens in South Africa, but your second-class status is much better than first-class status elsewhere. So black South Africans have an instinctive, really dislike and a sense of superiority to lots of other black Africans. However, what has happened post-independence is that they've become aware of the fact that black Africans generally are better educated, are more competent. So there's been this contradiction between the sense that they've been told historically that they're somehow meant to be better, but the reality of the fact is that they're less educated, less competent. And this obviously sets up lots of tensions. And when you have an economy which is not growing and where unemployment is spreading, particularly among poor people competing for resources, you're going to have these incidents. And these incidents, Selwyn, for those of us who live in South Africa, happen every day. The reason why this particular set of incidents have become newsworthy is partly because the Zulu king, is credited with making very awful statements about foreigners. And secondly, there's a series of them happening. But, most weeks in South Africa, there's a black foreigner killed randomly, wantonly because he's a foreigner. So this is not unusual. In the rest of Africa, we've had a series of really flowing again from some of the dysfunctions of the colonial period. These competitions for resources, which have taken tribal, a tribal form, which have generated these incidents.
How do these killings resonate with you or affect you as a foreigner
in South Africa? Personally, and this will sound a little callous, for those of us, because we can afford it, we're pretty isolated from it. We see it on TV the way you do. Okay, we will never, unless we make a wrong turn, we will never be affected by it. The way in which we're affected by it is because our gardeners don't turn up to work, because most of those are foreigners. We will be affected by it because when we go to the supermarket, okay, the person at the till, who will probably be South African, will make a snide, black South African will make a snide comment. But we're probably as affected by it as someone sitting in New York. The vast majority of black people, and black foreigners, the 95%, who don't live in the comfortable suburbs like us, they must fear for their lives, and quite rightly so.
Is this a gender-based thing? Are women killed as well?
Ironically, it's mainly men, and that's partly because this is one of the few times where chauvinism works for women, because men are seen as being the main competitors for resources. You'll hear stories of, oh, Nigerian men are taking South African women. So this is one of the few cases where chauvinism um, helps women.
But you've traveled throughout Africa and lived in different places. Are you ever fearful for your life?
In Africa?
Hmm.
No, I'm most fearful in South Africa, actually. Um, you know, Most of the conflict that happens in Africa is fairly well delineated and structured. You know, in ordinary traveling around Africa, people are amazingly welcome, Selwyn. You know, it's difficult to imagine or well, I think in some extent we grew up like that. You could arrive at the poorest village in Africa and have absolutely nothing. Um, and people having absolutely nothing, but they will offer you everything. You know.
So is it culturally juvenile to ask this question? Why aren't blacks, the perpetrators, asking, "Isn't he my brother?"
Oh, because no, it's not. I mean, it's a perfectly valid question. But the reason is that you might be my brother, but I'm still competing with you, and
Economics. Huh?
yeah, well, most things resolve themselves in the economic sphere. But also, if you're speaking specifically about South Africa,
Yeah.
I think I've explained that. In most of the rest of Africa, it's economic competition.
What are your deepest concerns, fears about the xenophobia in Juba and Johannesburg?
Juba is very different.
Oh,
Juba is a very, I suppose I should say, well delineated conflict between. Listen, what's happening in Juba is a proxy for competition between America and China, who are the two dominant forces in that part of the world competing for access to resources and for political influence. And they're mainly using surrogates within South Sudan and the general region to fight their wars. And so, in a sense, it's easier to resolve. If the Chinese and American governments decided how to share the oil in South Sudan, the conflict would end tomorrow. In South Africa, we have a very different scenario. It's very difficult for the ANC government to move decisively against those people in the townships. That's where they get their votes from.
oh,
And particularly because of the rise of the political opposition, particularly in places like Johannesburg, in some respects, the ANC, in terms of their political interests, are better off just hoping it all just peters out. Because they certainly cannot wholesomely condemn what's happening without suffering a political backlash. Because many black South Africans genuinely feel and believe that foreigners are a problem. Black foreigners are a problem. This is not a whimsical thing. I've been I've been told by educated black South Africans, I mean, one of whom lived in Guyana for many years because she couldn't go back before 1994. If you don't like our country, leave and go back. You foreigners are a problem.
she told you that.
Yes, I mean, without any compunction, and not lots of black South Africans have told me that.
Wow.
This is not, and I'm not talking about people hustling to survive. These are people driving BMWs and living in houses with pools and stuff. This is very common.
You're a social entrepreneur, Kojo. What does social entrepreneurship look like in the African context, and how can it look in the Guyanese context?
Can I start with the last bit of the question first?
Sure.
I believe that part of what I'm doing with the Rhyme Learning Trust, where we are saying to the state, let us share your burden. This burden of providing accessible, convenient education, relevant education. Let's share the burden. Let's use the kind of skills that we've developed in the private sector.